When the Schneiders needed advice about starting their own burger business, they sought out Karcher. As an eighth grade dropout, Karcher was working his way up from humble beginnings. In 1941, when a cart on Florence Avenue became available, Karcher bought it, securing a loan from Bank of America. Margaret Karcher was initially concerned about borrowing money to buy a hot dog cart, but the transition went smoothly. Margaret's doubts evaporated quickly as the little stand did a brisk business selling hot dogs and tamales. More than 6 decades later, Karcher proudly remembered that opening day, August 17th, 1941, when he made $14.75. By the time the Schneiders called upon Carl Karcher in 1948, he had 4 hot dog stands and had recently built Carl's Drive-In Barbecue restaurant that would serve as his first headquarters for Carl Karcher Enterprises. Carl Karcher was one of fast food's pioneers who built Carl's Jr., a chain of hot dog stands in Los Angeles. Originally from Upper Sandusky, Ohio, where he grew up a sharecropper's son, Karcher transformed a handful of hot dog stands into a $1.5 billion, 3,000 unit multinational Carl Karcher Enterprises. These opening selections today come from the book that we actually spoke about on the last episode, in which you and I learned about Harry Schneider in In-N-Out Burger. That book was called In-N-Out Burger, a behind-the-counter look at the fast food chain that breaks all the rules. And that book was written by Stacy Perman, and that's one that I highly recommend if you can pick that up for your library. I don't think that you would be disappointed with that particular book. It goes into great detail on Harry Schneider and how he founded In-N-Out Burger. Now, for today's episode, most of the source material comes from a book called Making It Happen, the story of Carl Karcher Enterprises, that was written by Carolyn Knight. So when I was reading the In-N-Out Burger book, it became very clear to me as I was going through that book that Carl Karcher was someone that Harry and Esther Schneider sought out early in business for his wise advice. Not only did he give advice, but they would become close friends and associates over the years, and Carl is mentioned many times throughout that book, which really piqued my curiosity in Carl, and I felt really compelled to take some time and learn more about his deeply driven nature. In that very first meeting, he's going to tell Harry Schneider the following. Carl told them to focus on a great product and to maintain the personal touch. It's so important to make people feel special, he explained. If we just look at that for a second, make people feel special. 4 simple words right there. Carl, he didn't need these complex business theories or these fancy marketing strategies when he's getting started. He really understood the fundamentals about human nature. Make them feel special, because people remember how you make them feel. And then he's going to go on and share his core value with Harry, which is very simple as well. It's never give up. Right here, we see 2 simple philosophies: make people feel special and never give up. This is really the heart of Carl Karcher. He was a man who operated from deep, uncomplicated truths. He put forth simple principles that were easy to understand, but they take discipline and follow through to execute over a long period of time, and this is what Carl did so well. As you know from the last episode, Harry Schneider, he kept things extremely simple and focused on the highest quality ingredients that he could serve his customers in a super clean environment, and then he topped it all off with superior customer service. I really like to think that Carl's words helped Harry solidify that he was on the correct path with his thinking, and that it gave him that extra push to start his business. It kind of reminds me of a young Henry Ford who had the chance to meet his hero Thomas Edison one night when they were at a convention together, and he would ask Edison if he was on the right path in life by working on the gasoline engine, to which Edison would respond in the following way. Yes, there is a big future for any lightweight engine that can develop a high horsepower and be self-contained. No one kind of motive power is ever going to do all the work of the country. We do not know what electricity can do, but I take it for granted that it can't do everything. Keep on with your engine. if you get what you're after, I can see a great future. That very brief exchange right there gives Ford an immense fuel to continue forward with the development of his gasoline engine. In a very similar fashion here, Carl, who was actually younger in age but more advanced in business years, gave Harry validation that his insights were correct and that he was on the right path towards his dream for opening his own restaurant business. Then to top it off, Carl tells Harry his core value, which is to never give up. For me, as someone who really enjoys studying those individuals that are deeply driven in business, that right there was enough to pique my curiosity about Carl Karcher. And I found the book Making It Happen on eBay, and I picked up a copy. I think I paid somewhere around $40 for the book. And overall, it's in very good condition for 45 years old. And then, as an added bonus, it's signed by Carl himself. It says, "With God's blessings, July 17th, 1981, Carl N. Karcher." I think that's my first autographed book, which I think is extremely cool. So instead of marking the book up like I normally do with most of my books, I just put sticky notes all over it so that I could try to keep the book in somewhat good condition. I can really tell that the spine, it's starting to dry out a little bit, and it makes a bit of a crackling noise when I turn the pages, so I have to be a little bit careful with it. But overall, the book, it's only 140 pages, and there's a lot of images in the book, so it's really a super fast read. For the show today, I just really wanted to focus on what made Carl so deeply driven, and then the lessons that we can learn from him that will help us in our own businesses. If you're new to the show, I just wanted to take a moment to welcome you. I'm glad that you stopped by to check out the podcast. My name is Larry, and this is a podcast where we talk about great founders and entrepreneurs from history who followed their purpose in life and were deeply driven to make it happen, which leads us to our story today with Carl Karcher. If you're returning, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of your time to check out a new episode today. If you'd like to pick up a copy of this particular book, what I would do in this case is actually recommend that you go out to eBay for this one. If you just search by Making It Happen, Carl Karcher, you're going to see several copies that'll pop up anywhere from like $20 up to like $200 for ones that are signed and maybe have a longer inscription in there if that's something that you're looking for. Then for any of the other books that we cover on the podcast, there is a link in the show notes. If you use that link to buy any of the books, you'll be helping to support children's literacy, as I'm donating 100% of all Amazon affiliate commissions to help support that cause, because I believe that children should have the chance to always be learning and enhancing their reading skills. That is extremely important, my friend. Then one last thing before we hop into the finer details here. For those of you that have followed the show on Apple, Spotify, Overcast, and Podcast Addicts, or anywhere else for that matter, I just wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you. I really do appreciate that. If you haven't followed the show, it's super simple to do, and you'll be updated each time a new episode drops. Then, as an added bonus, it's 100% ad-free. I don't do any ads on the podcast. It's 100% free. I just ask that if you find some value, if you can just leave me a review or do a quick follow, that is more than enough for me, my friend. All right, with that, how about we hop into the book and take a look at Carl Karcher and see what we can learn from this fine, deeply driven founder and businessman. So we're going to go back in time here a little bit to when Carl was perhaps 11 or 12 years old. This is when things really kind of get started for him. He is growing up on his parents' 300-acre farm in Sandusky, Ohio, and he's just passed his 8th grade proficiency exam. And we get a view of the early days of the Depression here in the book. It's really starting to weigh down on Carl and his family. He has this really deep desire for the love of the land that he's living on with his family. This forces Carl to drop out of school, which at that time was extremely common. We learn from the author here that Carl, he's already a hard worker, and he dives in even deeper once he leaves school. So now, instead of poring over history lessons or studying the geography of faraway continents, Carl spent 12 to 14 hours a day harvesting crops, baling hay, shredding corn, stocking grain, and attending to the never ending number of jobs necessary to keep the farm operating at its maximum. Hard work was nothing new to this teenager. Since he could first remember, he had gladly assumed more than his fair share of the family chores. One word there jumps out for me. That is the word gladly. Carl found joy in the work itself. He found purpose in what he was contributing to the farm and for his family. At 13 years old, he already understood that work, when done in the right spirit, in the right context, it wasn't a burden, it was a privilege, one that he embraces gladly. Then, to go even further outside of the farm, he's going to go about making extra money shoveling snow in the wintertime for 10 cents an hour. And then he would also go help farmers with their crops. We get an inside view here from his brother Bernard, who gives us an insight to his work ethic. And he would say the following about Carl. He could milk 6 cows in the time that it took the rest of us to milk 4. And then, as the sun set late in the day, we would suggest calling it a day. But Carl would always talk us into bringing in just one more load of hay. And if we stop and think about that just for a second, while everyone else was ready to quit for the day, Carl was wanting them to take in one more load. Let's get out there, guys, and do one more. I know we can do it. Follow me and let's get this done. I can just hear him saying that right now. This wasn't because someone was forcing him to do it, and he didn't get paid more for doing this. This was just who Carl was. This is the seed of everything that's going to follow. He's relentless. He has a joyful drive, and he just wants to do a little bit more. Carl has that deep fire inside. And I really think it's simple. We see this so often on the show, and it reminds me a lot of a young Samuel Cunard who, in the early 1800s, at just 10 years old, would go out and collect scraps of wood in the wharves around Nova Scotia, and then he would bundle them all together and sell them to locals for firewood. We also spoke about Sam Walton many times in the past, who, when he was growing up on his farm in Missouri, he did a similar thing here. He was out there raising and selling goats and rabbits. He was slinging newspapers early in the morning. And then his mom, she would milk the cows every afternoon so that when he got home from football practice, he could go make deliveries. Right here in the book, before we even get too deep, we can almost predict that Carl is going to have some degree of success in life. His early work ethic is an indicator. Now, as Carl was growing up, the family, what they're going to do is they're going to move every couple of years. And generally, they would move to a larger farm. It's said that his parents, they were trying to save money to buy their own place. One maxim that his father had that he would instill in Carl is that he would not be allowed to use the word can't. Thus, his dad would often say the following to all of his children. Can't died in the poorhouse many years ago. For Carl and the family, you don't have the luxury of can't when your family needs to buy food and put it on the table. Carl grew up in a world where can't wasn't a philosophy, it was a practical reality. Either you found a way or you went hungry. Simple as that. My mother, I remember she was almost the exact same way. She despised that word can't. Whenever I said that, she would always look me in the eye and she would say, you can do anything that you want in this world. And I never want to hear you say the word can't. That was repeated over and over. And I know for me, that just carried a lot of weight over time. When I really put my mind to something, I would go at it full force. I never felt like I couldn't do something in life. There was always a path forward if you looked deep enough. I believe that is a very valuable insight that we can all learn from. There is no can't. You can always figure a way out, my friend. This is just practical, wise advice for us. And for Carl, it's the exact same. On the farm, he works his ass off and he builds a solid foundation for himself and he saves a little bit of money here. By the age of 20, his uncle Ben is going to offer Carl a job working at his feed and seed store, which was located in California. Carl, he was really unsure about whether to leave the farm. So, what he would do is he would go to his father and seek out advice. And his father's going to keep it short and sweet here. He's going to say, if I were a young man, I would go to California. And with that, Carl and his friends, they're going to head to California. They're going to leave on Thanksgiving Day of 1937, and it would take them about a week to arrive in California, where he quickly takes up work with his uncle. Now, after arriving there, he was really enjoying the weather in California, and he's also going to meet a young woman by the name of Margaret Hines, who he quickly falls in love with. Margaret's family was very much like Carl's. They had a large family, and he's immediately accepted in a very warm and open way. That makes him realize very quickly that he misses his own family back in Ohio. So he's going to make the hard decision to head back east in August of 1938, leaving behind his newfound love and also his job. But when he gets back home, reality hits him that he just left the one that he's supposed to be with. So he's going to hang out in Ohio for a little while. Then in the book, it says that he would head back to California several months later in early 1939. Once he gets back to California, he really expects that he's just going to be able to walk into his uncle's business and that he would be hired back immediately and he would just have a job that he could start working on. He's going to be hit with a hard dose of reality right here by his Uncle Ben. His nephew would not be offered a second chance. It was a dejected young man who left Karcher Feed and Seed Store that afternoon, 1939. His uncle went out and hired other help. He needed men in the business to help him out. He wasn't going to hold that spot open for Carl, and he felt that he had really blown his chance that he was given to make a name for himself in the business. However, Carl right here says that looking back, this was really a blessing for him because it forced him to go out and find a different line of work, which is going to see him land at a local bakery, Armstrong Bakery, that was located in LA. I believe right here we're starting to see some of Carl's depth. It really takes a lot of wisdom and character to transform this rejection into an opportunity. You can't always control what happens to you, but you can control how you respond. We get a firsthand view of how Carl is going to respond to this blessing in the following way. But before we get there, this is really a great reminder for you and I that in life, those setbacks can really be an absolute catalyst that we need to dig in deeper or possibly even allow us to meet our purpose in life. We spoke about Jim Casey a few episodes ago, I believe episode 16, how he was rejected by the bank when he needed a loan to expand in the early days of UPS. And the bank manager is going to tell him that determined men can do anything, which he would turn into a maximum. He adjusted that just a little bit. He would say determined men working together can do anything. And that is 100% correct because Jim and his partners, they would go on to build the biggest delivery company on the planet through their hard work, strict focus on service, and determination. For Carl, he starts off with a bang in the bakery. He's going to be quickly promoted to a delivery driver. And then past that, he's going to be married to Margaret in November of 1939. Carl, he's going to find himself working really long days. He's grinding it out, making deliveries all over Los Angeles. Right here, he could have fallen into just a routine where he's putting his life on fast forward, not really paying attention to his surroundings, just going out every day, making deliveries, getting home at night, repeat the next day. But I think that Carl, he really has his eyes open to the world. And what he starts to notice is that these little hot dog carts are popping up all over LA. This is really crucial for the story because this sees him delivering buns to those little carts sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. So he starts to do a little bit of math and he kind of figures out, well, maybe it could be possible that if I own one of these carts, this could be a good way for me to supplement my income and make a little bit extra for me and the newly married wife here. I think this is the difference between being a worker and an entrepreneur. Carl was present in every moment, and he was looking for opportunities that were in plain sight. It wouldn't take him very long because July 17th, 1941, he's going to be hit dead on by his purpose in life. Remember, he has this really deep drive and he's a hard worker. He just hadn't discovered that one true purpose in life that would be his ultimate passion. Let's just read here so we can learn a little bit more about this. When Lou Richmond offered to sell his tiny cart under the bright red and white umbrella on one of the busiest street corners in LA, Carl was excited about the possibility of purchasing it. He hurried home to discuss the opportunity with Margaret, his closest and most valued confidant. Although Margaret was less enthused about the enterprise and more concerned about her husband going into debt, she and Carl agreed that it was a chance they should take. Together they went to the bank to borrow $311, using their recently purchased 1941 Plymouth as collateral, adding the funds to the $15 that Margaret had in her purse. The couple hurried to the little hot dog stand and handed Mr. Richmond the money, receiving a handwritten receipt in exchange. In the book, there's an image of that receipt dated 7/17/41. And it's kind of cool here because this book that I'm reading from was signed 40 years later on 7/17/81. I just noticed that, and I think that's kind of neat. So anyway, let's keep going here. Carl and Margaret, they're going to take over that stand, and they're immediately in business. They're going to open every day at 10 a.m., and they're going to close at 2 a.m. And this goes on 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're going to be located next to the Goodyear factory. I think right from the start here, Carl did a good job picking a cart that had a high traffic area. And this would be one of his core philosophies as he grows, always looking for traffic. And right off the bat, they had the benefit of selling all the hot dogs and tamales to all of the hungry workers that were on lunch break or in between shifts. In their first day in business, they're going to sell $14.75 worth of hot dogs and tamales. And this is a number that Carl would remember for the rest of his life, $14.75. Because to Carl, every penny matters, every customer matters. This was really sacred to him. He paid attention to his cost, and this leads us to the next lesson. Because you see, Carl, he's going to hire 2 younger men to run the stand during the hours that they were open while he was still out there making deliveries for that bread company. He would often stop by the cart multiple times a day to check in on sales, see how things were going, make sure the cart was well stocked up. And in the beginning, he's a very trusting man. But what he starts to notice is that the sales per shift, they were only around maybe $9 or $10. And he was expecting something like 12 to 15 per shift. So he kind of starts to zero in on what's happening here. And he quickly discovers that one of those young men was buying 3 dozen of his own hot dog buns. And then he was using Carl's hot dogs and condiments. He would sell those on the side, and then he would just put the money in his own pocket. That was the reason why Carl wasn't making as much as he had expected. So he takes kind of another bold move here. Carl, he confronts the employee, and he tells them that, you can retain your job here if you admit to what you've done wrong. And at the same time, promise not to resort back to this behavior again. The employee would confess. He ends up retaining his job. In a short time after that, he actually gets a 25% raise. I think that moment just adds more depth to Carl and his nature here. If we think about it, the employee is literally stealing from him. Instead of going out and firing this employee in anger, Carl takes a different path and he offers forgiveness as a way to move forward. Carl saw something in this young man beyond a mistake. He saw potential, and he saw someone worth investing in. And I think it goes back to forgiveness. One quote that Fred Rogers was fond of saying, and I know that we've mentioned it a few times on the show in the past, and this one is really short and sweet, yet it's very deep at the same time. It goes like this: "The one thing that evil cannot stand is forgiveness. It simply disintegrates in the presence of forgiveness. I believe that is so true. And for Carl, he grew up in the Catholic Church and he continued his Christian faith and put it front and center in his personal life and also in business. Thus, we really see him exhibit forgiveness early on in business, and this really sets a tone as he generally was known for treating his employees very well, paying them higher than average wages, and oftentimes extending a lot of trust to his employees. I think you and I are seeing a pattern here. Carl, he made people feel special. He never gives up and he extends forgiveness. He pays well and he trusts his employees. These aren't strategies, they're values. He was operating for something deeper here, a fundamental belief in human dignity and the potential that they held. Needless to say, things are going to start off generally very well. He's going to rename this first cart the Blimp in honor of the proximity to the Goodyear factory. And I really love that. I think that's very creative of Carl to rename the cart the Blimp. That's kind of cool. He's going to leverage this early success. He's going to quickly buy 2 more stands. And this really saw his schedule become very hectic. In his eyes, they just open even wider here. And he starts to dream of the day that he can be his own boss. And we learn the following from the book here. Success was intoxicating, and dreaming that someday he might be able to become self-supporting. Carl kept his eyes open for the opportunity to add yet another cart to the ones he owned. By the end of 1942, Carl owned a 3rd cart at Normandy in Manchester in the parking lot of Smith and Theus Texaco station. At this point, Carl, he really needs help to start managing the business, and he's going to bring in one of his longtime friends, that of Phil Smith. He would be the first manager, and as well as just an all-around guy at the same time. He would oversee the operations while Carl was out working his bakery delivery job. This is one of the things in the book that it says that Carl did really well. He had this knack for scouting out talent, knowing who was trustworthy, who to keep a close eye on, and who to avoid. And I guess we already got a taste of this just a moment ago with one of his first employees and how he handled that particular situation. Carl's talent recognition philosophy is very simple. He paid attention to character over that of credentials. But Carl is only getting started. He's soon going to purchase his 4th stand, and at that point, he decides it's time to leave the job at the bakery. At the age of 26, he's finally out on his own in this little mini restaurant enterprise operation that he had going. You think that would be enough for Carl, at least for the short time anyways, but he takes another bold action here. Remember, he was the one who wanted to bring in extra loads of hay. Well, that philosophy continues on in business here because he and Margaret, they decide to move to Anaheim and start a full service restaurant. Now, in Anaheim, that's where Margaret's family was from, so that was nice that they could move closer to her family, but this is really a dramatic shift from those little hot dog carts that he's operating. But Carl's very thankful because he does have that loyal manager in Phil West, and he puts a lot of trust to Phil to run those carts while he moves to Anaheim. And once he arrives there, he's going to find a little restaurant for sale. Bob's restaurant it was. He's going to pay $4,200 for this particular restaurant. They're going to end up closing that business for several weeks so that they could bring it up to their standards. Carl, he really wanted everything to be immaculate and really well organized and clean. These were the simple standards that became Carl's signature. Do the basic things excellent every time. Now, prior to opening, they're going to change the name to Carl's Drive-In Barbecue. And for the first time, we're going to see that famous star that's going to be used as part of their logo, and that would become very recognizable as part of Carl's Jr. in the future. Their first day sales at this 30-person restaurant would come in at $77.64, which it says in the book was far below their $100 a day payroll that they had to commit to. Yet Carl, he didn't let this hold him back. He knew that things were going to pick up over time, and he was really focused on serving high-quality food in a clean environment. And you know what's going to happen? word is going to spread very quickly about his restaurant, and things would generally pick up after this. So, shortly after the restaurant opens, Carl's going to be called into the army during the war. He had some challenges with his dexterity trying to climb up and over objects, so he would mostly just serve in the California area, which would allow him to make brief trips home on the weekends to see his family and check in on the business. His friend and associate Phil West is going to continue to run those hot dog carts, who would go about making improvements to them that would help them increase sales. And I think that's just a key insight for us here, that seeking out top talent and empowering them really is a superpower in our business. And if it weren't for Phil, I really believe that Carl's business trajectory would have been dramatically different. He was really fortunate to have this loyal associate and manager by his side who would continue to run those hot dog carts and help out with the business, especially while Carl was away in the army. Now, this would only be about a year or so that he was away. The war would end, and then what he would do is he would return home. And once he gets home, he's going to dive in head first, as described in the book here. Attempting to make up for lost time, he worked long hours at the drive-in, cooking, working in the fountain, waiting on tables, and even providing car service when his car hops were busy. For me, I always love to see the founder in action when they're invested in all aspects of the business. You almost know immediately that he's going to be a success at this point. He's learning his business from A to Z. When you know your business from A to Z, there's no problem that you can't solve. And then at the same time, Carl is leading by example. And you know what? When you lead by example, your employees are going to follow your lead. And I really like to view that as imprinting on the business DNA. This is what Carl is doing with his strong work ethic. Now, along with this, Carl, he noticed something that was happening in the area. Hamburgers. They're starting to become popular all around LA. So what does he do? He starts selling them from his food carts in his restaurants. They're going to use an ice cream scooper to portion the meat, and then they would press it into a patty with a tin can. And it's not going to take them very long because they're going to be selling more hamburgers than hot dogs at these little stands. And right from the start, Carl, he takes the same approach as he does with everything else. Quality burgers. They would be no more than 20% fat. They would come with a toasted bun, fresh lettuce, and tomato, and then Carl's special sauce that he had developed. With the popularity of the hamburgers, Carl knew that he needed additional locations. So him and Phil, they would set out to identify locations that had the highest rates of pedestrian traffic. Then once they had identified a spot, they would go and lease the little land. If we just jump into the book, we can understand a little bit more about what they were doing. They were developing these mini restaurants, if you will, and I think this is quite brilliant, and we can talk about this after we read this following selection here. Carl and Phil often cruised the LA streets, looking for prime pieces of property on which to build new hamburger stands. Once negotiations had been made with the owner of the land, the two men would bring in a small prefabricated aluminum building, bolt it to a 7 by 10 foot slab of concrete, and thus launch a new takeout restaurant. Site selection was a key factor in the success of Carl's stands. He was always attempting to choose locations that drew crowds and offered visibility, so that his stands sprung up throughout the city next to carnivals, shoe repair shops, and service stations. This is brilliantly simple. His setup time here? Weeks, not months. Capital requirements for Carl? Minimal. His risk? Well, they were controlled. If a location didn't work out, they would simply sell it off as it was stated in the book. Carl really has a first principles mindset right here. What's the simplest way to test a location? Carl's answer to that? Put up a small building and start selling hamburgers. And we're in the early 50s here. Carl recognized that he needed prime property where customers were located. Other great founders that we've studied on the show also knew this. For example, Joe Colomb over at Trader Joe's. In the very early days, he would spend inordinate amounts of time driving around city streets and local neighborhoods, and it says the following in his book, Becoming Trader Joe. There's no substitute for driving a location to ferret out traffic problems and do it in the nighttime also. And either I or one of my colleagues would drive the location all over again just before we actually sign the lease. Generally speaking, I would not look at any trading area with fewer than 40,000 households likely to contain core customers. His core customers were, of course, the overeducated and underpaid, and he focused heavily to make sure that they were inside of his trading areas. And if you'd like to learn more about how Trader Joe identified his core customers and site selection, I would highly recommend his book. It is, my friend, a masterclass in grocery retailing. We also covered Trader Joe on episode 4 if you'd like to check that out. Another founder that I can think of here that comes top of mind who was notorious for site selection was Sam Walton, who would actually use airplanes to fly over little bitty towns. He would tilt it up sideways so that he could see out the window really well and look for locations on the ground where his target customers were likely to drive their cars into. And what he was looking for was property on the edge of metropolitan areas that were starting to grow because he could get it for cheap. Now, another thing here that I really like about Carl's approach was that once he had a site selection, he's going to bring in this small fabricated building and build it down, and then boom, good to go. There was no lengthy construction times. He would literally turn that site around in a matter of a few weeks, and he'd be selling hamburgers. In one sentence that really caught my eye in the book, and I think this is key to Carl's growth in business, especially in his early years, it says, Carl enjoyed his work, always attempted to treat his customers as if they were guests in his own home. And how do you treat guests in your home? With warmth, with generosity, and with genuine care. And this is why Carl's business succeeded. It wasn't a business to him. For Carl, work was simply play. He was 100% doing exactly what he loved. This radiated to his customers, and he treated them like family and guests in his own home. He took the extra time to talk to guests, to know them, to make them feel valued and appreciated, and this built up a community of repeat business over time. Things are going really well for Carl at this point, but one day he's going to get a notice in the mail, and this, my friend, it was not good news. How Carl responds to this is just a super valuable insight for us. Let me walk you through this here. So he had gotten this letter, and the owners, they decided not to renew his lease. And why might that be, you might ask? Well, the owners had decided to go into the restaurant business themselves. Thus, they gave him 30 days to vacate the premises. In the book, we can see firsthand Carl's reaction. Almost in tears, he headed home to share the bad tidings with Margaret and to decide how best to combat this new chain of events. Throughout a sleepless night, Carl's mind was active as he sought a solution to his dilemma. While others might despair or give in to the pressures that seemed destined to close his business, Carl reacted to the problem as if it were a challenge to test his stamina and initiative. And here's what separates great founders from average ones. Carl felt it, then he acted. This is what never give up looks like in practice. You feel the emotion, you honor it, and then you move forward swiftly with a plan. Dead on 100% reminds me of Sam Walton when his landlord pulled his lease at that first Ben Franklin store in Newport, Arkansas. He had taken that store from $72,000 a year in sales to over $250,000 a year in sales in just 5 years. The landlord saw how well he was doing, decides to pull his lease and give the store to his own son, who, by the way, couldn't even come close to replicating what Sam had built up, and the store would ultimately fail. But for Sam, he didn't dwell on this loss. He simply picked himself up. He moved on, more determined than ever, and he opened a new store in Bentonville, Arkansas. For Carl, losing this lease, it takes place 5 or 6 years before Walton lost his, and I really just wonder, what Carl would have said to a young Sam Walton as he was just entering into that first store in Newport, Arkansas. We saw early in the episode that he was a forgiving man when one of his employees was caught stealing. Now he takes kind of a similar approach here. He shifts his focus and he views this as a challenge. How can I overcome this situation? He's asking himself in his mind. And if you had to guess, how long do you think it might take him to come up with a solution? For me, I'd say maybe a week, possibly 2 weeks. We already know that he moves fast and he's keenly aware of his environment. But to gain a deeper insight about Carl, I'll tell you, it took one day. Yes, my friend, in one day he had worked out a solution. And let me just walk you through the chain of events here. First, down the street from his restaurant, on his father in law's property, there was this open space that faced the road. Second, at the back of the property, there was a 3-car garage. Third thing here is he called his father in law to make sure he could use the land and that he would sell that garage, which he would for $400. Fourth item, he called the health department to make sure that what he was thinking up in his mind would work. And good news, it would. Fifth, he gains approval from the city and the county to move that garage to a slab at the front of the property. And then the sixth thing here is by that afternoon, he had Stanton home movers on site moving that building to the front of the property. One day here, my friend. 6 steps, problem solved. I really believe this is operational genius at its simplest. Carl saw the problem clearly, he broke it down into simple steps, and he executed. When you understand your business at the fundamental level, solutions become obvious and action becomes immediate. I think this is simply amazing. The title of the book is called Making It Happen. Well, that's no bullshit. This is what Carl did. He made it happen. He didn't sit around pouting about losing his lease. He came up with a solution and he made it happen. Such a wise and practical example for you and I right here, that when we're faced with challenges in business, there's no need to dwell on them past their expiration date. We need to drive forward and make it happen. Just like Carl is going to spend the next 4 weeks finishing out the building. Then let's just hop into the book here and see how this went. On November 15th, the day Carl was to vacate the old drive-in, movers brought the equipment and furnishings across the street to the new building. And after closing only one day during the entire operation, it was with pride that Carl opened his new restaurant on November 17th to many of his loyal customers waiting outside. He had been put to the test, he knew, but he had overcome the obstacles in his path and was now ready to get on to the business at hand. One day, in the middle of moving his entire restaurant. Because everyday close, my friend, means customers going somewhere else, employees who weren't earning any income and lost momentum, the attention to continuity, to maintaining the rhythm of business. This is what separates good operators from great ones. Simply an impressive story if you ask me about a deeply driven founder. Now you might ask, what's his next action in business here? Where is the story going? Carl, he's eventually going to launch Carl's Jr. And why would it be called Carl's Jr.? Well, it was called that because it was a smaller version of his normal drive-in restaurant. It had a simpler menu that was developed around the ever-growing popularity of the hamburger and the fast-paced American lifestyle that was developing around that. Carl observed that people may not always have time to come inside and sit down and enjoy their meals, and they were really looking for options where they could bring their food home and enjoy it, or potentially bring it back to their workplaces during the day. These smaller hamburger stands, they had given Carl the time to work out what he needed to perfect his vision of the perfect hamburger, and this results in the junior-sized restaurant that would open in 1956 with locations in Anaheim and then another one in Brea. As these locations opened up, they're also going to offer a drive-through, and at the time this was a little bit of a newer concept that a lot of places were just starting to put into practice, And most places were still drive in, where you drive your car in, you park it there, and they come out and wait on you. Carl here, he goes with the drive through. And we know that he was really close friends with Harry Schneider, who had started In-N-Out Burger in 1948, which is about 7 or 8 years before Carl decides to put in his drive through. And it doesn't say this in the book, nor does it say it in the In-N-Out book. But I like to think that perhaps Harry had some level of impact on Carl. It does say in the In-N-Out book that the two men, they often visited each other's stores, and then they would report back to one another on the good and the bad things that were happening in those stores so that they can make improvements or keep doing more of the good stuff. And I think that really tells me that they were in close contact with one another and they trusted each other's opinions. Thus, if Carl saw how well Harry was doing with his drive-throughs, that may have just pushed him over the edge to pull the trigger opening his own drive-throughs, or possibly Harry even gave him guidance on how to set up a successful drive-through. After all, Harry, he did invent that two-way speaker box so that his customers could order through the drive-through. As I was talking about that, another thought popped in my mind here. What a valuable relationship when you can talk to someone who's in the same business, basically a competitor, but you're able to trust their judgments and you can offer feedback to one another on where things were going well or what could be improved. Imagine if you have Harry Snyder, who was the founder of In-N-Out Burger, and he comes into your restaurant, and then the next day he sits down with you and he gives you an overview of everything that he noticed. How much better are you going to be after that? For me, holy smokes, I can almost see the line of customers growing longer and longer as I work to increase my quality in my focus towards providing higher levels of service. And why? Because a legend just came into my restaurant and would give me a PhD in just a few hours. The friendship between Carl and Harry reveals something profound about both men. They understood that competition doesn't have to mean isolation. They were secure enough in themselves to share ideas and to learn from one another, to genuinely want each other to succeed. This is so rare amongst competitors in business. Carl and Harry both knew the real path to success, the principles of quality, service, and treating people right. These are the simple truths that anyone can apply if they have the discipline and the character to do it and do it consistently. I'll just ask, do you have a business associate that you can trust, who you could set up a Carl and Harry like relationship, trading valuable insights on each other's businesses? Imagine how that might take you to the next level in your business. Even just focusing on business education, reading high quality books, and listening to high quality podcasts will absolutely help you reach the next level. You can never stop learning and growing. Only good things will result, my friend. All right, that was a fun tangent there. I always like to think about what the outcomes would be if two founders had the chance to meet, like Carl and Sam Walton that I had mentioned earlier, or when they do meet, like with Carl and Harry, what the outcome was. I find that simply fascinating how two deeply driven individuals can have major impacts on one another. Now, for Carl here, the outcome is going to be quite successful for his Carl's Jr. locations. That drive-through that he implements, it's going to start out slow, but it doesn't take long before it quickly catches on and is going to be a major portion of their business. Carl's going to tap his brother Don to come in and run the Carl's Jr. locations. And almost immediately, we can see that Carl was taking care of his employees from the start, and this is really key. It says in the book that he offered paid vacations, medical and life insurance, whereas competitors in the fast food industry, most of them, they didn't offer any of those options. It was simply just come in, work your shift, we'll pay you the minimum wage. Carl went above and beyond this. And this is going to lead him to building a really loyal team of employees and managers, which is really needed, and it helps him grow the popularity of Carl's Jr. as they're going to spring up all over the LA area. At the same time, this helps them develop their guiding policies. And this is developed from the crew and the management. They would develop this philosophy that said, we would not sell a product that we would not be proud to serve to our own families. And it's just one simple philosophy that really guides every decision about quality, ingredients, and the preparation of their foods. You don't need a 100-page operation manual when you have one clear principle to follow. Early in business, Carl imprinted into his corporate DNA that the customer was family. He served them high quality foods and he welcomed them into his establishments. We can see this imprinting. It feeds directly into that guiding policy that was set forth by the crew. And it's a true firsthand example of what happens when you set the example and the expectations for your team. This is going to be the catalyst for their growth. By the mid 60s, there were about 24 Carl's Jr. locations, and they were all doing really well. This would see Carl take a step where he consolidates all of his business entities into what would become known as Carl Karcher Enterprises, or CKE. This really gave him the corporate springboard to start operating from. Carl's going to continue to work really hard to maintain that mom and pop shop small business feeling, and he really wanted to continue to focus on his customers. Thus, in 1968, he's going to launch a revamped version of Carl's Jr. that had spacious and comfortable dining rooms. He had slimmed down the menu to basically just burgers, hot dogs, fries, malts, and beverages. And again, I just really wonder if it was his friend Harry Schneider over at In-N-Out Burger that may have had an influence on that in some way. This was at a time in the restaurant business, especially that of the fast food chains, where it was becoming popular all over America, and they were just adding tons and tons of menu items. What we see here is that Carl, he's scaling back and he's keeping it simple for the customer. This concept is going to become super popular, and this is going to see Carl adding 20 to 40 new locations a year. Now, at the time this book was published in 1981, Carl, he had over 300 locations. They were doing over $100 million a year in sales, and he had just opened a new 20-acre complex that would hold their corporate headquarter offices. And then he also opened a 140,000 square foot commissary that says in the book was capable of supporting more than 500 locations. So he was really tooling up for additional growth. The company would also go public in 1981, and this is where I'm going to leave the story for our show today. This really is a fantastic founder story of how a poor farm boy from Ohio with a really strong work ethic and a deep drive and a love for business and serving people well made a big impact on the world. Carl was presented with his purpose as a young man, delivering those hot dog buns and buying his first hot dog cart for $326. 40 years, same principles. Make people feel special, never give up, treat everyone with dignity, keep it simple, and do quality work. Carl didn't change his philosophy as he grew. He stayed true to it, growing his business to more than $100 million in sales by 1981. Carl was deeply driven. He followed his purpose. He turned it into a passion, and that passion simply turned into play. Carl absolutely loved what he did every single day. Carl, he's going to pass away January 11th of 2008 at the age of 90. Thanks for listening today, my friend. I hope you found some value in the episode today. If you did, possibly you would consider leaving me a review or some feedback on your favorite listening platform. I would greatly appreciate it. I hope to see you back here soon. Until next time, make it a beautiful day in the neighborhood, my friend.